Hey guys, my project was on the Vietnam War draft. Here, let me share my sound. All right. The Vietnam War draft happened on December 1st, 1969, and went on from until 1972. And more American boys throughout these years were called into this war. And so the reason why I say boys was because the people who were drafted were literally boys. They were young baby boomers born mostly after World War II. So when the draft was called on December 1st, 1969, these boys were ranging from the ages of 18 to 26, which means they were born between the dates January 1st, 1944 and December 31st, 1950. With the initial draft on December 1st, 1969, it was really interesting to see the form they took to do this draft. And this was in the form of a literal lottery. So here's a clip of what they did, and you'll understand why it's a lottery, basically.
Choose the first. September 14th.
September 14/001.
Yeah, what you just saw was a televised event. So the draft was a televised event, and it was on December 1st, 1969, and boys from all around the world got on to watch this televised event to see where their date of birth would be placed on the draft. And and the way it worked was literally in the form of a lottery wheel. So the wheel that they picked the balls out from contained 366 balls, each with a unique date of the year. It's 366 because of the leap year. And so what would happen is that the man would reach his hand and randomly pick a random date of the year in one of the balls. And chronologically, 1 through 56, basically, men born on these dates would be the first to be called into war. So what you saw here was that September 14th was number 001 in the Vietnam War draft lottery, meaning that men between the ages of 18 through 26 born on September 14th were to be the first men asked to go into the war. And so here I'll continue a little bit of the video so you can get a better grasp on what is happening.
Mr. Paul M. Murray, Rhode Island. Go again, huh? April 24th.
April 24 is 002.
Okay, so here you see that April 24th was picked as number 002. And so this means that men between the ages of 18 through 26, born on April 24th, were to be the second group of men drafted into the war. And because of this, not all men were drafted in the war at the end, because mainly only like the first numbers were called. And it got to around the 90s, up until where men were drafted, and it got to 215 where men had to go to get their medical screening to go into the war, but they didn't actually go into the war. And so here's a slide to see if you would have been chosen in the draft. So if you want to pause the video, the left column is days of the month, and the top row is the months, and the relative numbers is the order number that your birthday would have been called on the Vietnam lottery draft. So yeah, so you can pause the video and look at that. So of course, with a random draft, there is going to be a lot of draft evasion. So more than half of the 27 million men eligible for the draft during the Vietnam War were deferred, exempted, or disqualified from serving. And so there were a bunch of ways that individuals evaded the war. A huge one simply being men in college getting an education, because people like Clinton and Biden were able to evade the draft because of these circumstances. They were in college during the draft, so they did not need to go into war. So education was one of the biggest ways you could get out of it. Another way you could get out of it was by being a conscientious objector. So people who openly opposed any kind of military service were excused for serving. And this was mainly Jehovah's Witnesses, the Amish, and Quakers. And it was religions that were considered peace churches that did not have to take part in the war. But any dishonest, conscientious objection that was due to religion, basically, was of course extremely illegal. And you could make up a health condition also to get out of the war. So what many people did was would do a lot of illegal drugs. They wouldn't sleep for days, and they made themselves appear extremely unhealthy before they had to go in to do their medical screening so they could avoid the draft. Um, Another crazy fact is that upwards of 40,000 Americans fled to Canada to avoid this draft. So it was kind of like the book we read from O'Brien, who was thinking about going to Canada, because many people actually did this. And another way you could avoid the draft was by simply enlisting in the military, because if you completed a military service obligation, you legally could not be forced to re-enter the military. And if you were called up to be drafted, you could avoid it by enlisting and choosing your service in the military. And so, again, of course, with random and forced drafts, huge protests took place as well. And this was in the early 60s that college students on campuses became like the fire starters of anti-war protest. And what they protested was basically an unjust war, and that when they graduated out of college, they would be eligible to go into the war during the draft, because if you remember, college students did not have to. So what many of these college students did was they burned their draft cards. So these protests took place in the early 60s, where they would burn their draft cards, which kind of raises the question, why did they have draft cards before the initial draft? Well, young men in the 60s were required by law to register with their local draft board. So this was before the draft of 1969. And so what they did at these places was that they would be classified according to their fitness for service, and they were given a draft card with their name, their age, and draft status. So starting in 1964, students began to burn their draft cards as an act of protest. And by 1969, student body presidents of 253 universities wrote to the White House saying that they personally planned to refuse induction and not join the military. And they joined over 500,000 others that would do the same exact thing during the course of this war. And in the 1970s, these protests reached their peak. And by 1972, they were more illegal conscientious objectors than actual draftees, because they weren't part of peace churches or anything. So during this time, major cities faced many problems, that many individuals were backlogs of induction refusal legal cases, which means over 200,000 people were reported as delinquents during this time because of this, because they refused to go to the war. Though these draft resistors were successful in their protest, because there were so many people that needed to be punished and sent to prison for refusing to go in the war, that out of the over 200,000 people that avoided this draft, less than 9,000 were actually convicted. So yeah, that's my project on the Vietnam draft. Thank you.